This is our first lecture on World War One. World War One obviously wasn't known as World War One when it was going on because it was the only world war the people had known it as. So it was called the Great War. What we're going to see through this chapter is over 70 million soldiers are going to be recruited and are joining into these armies. There's going to be 9 million deaths throughout the war. If you average that out, that's 6,000 soldiers dying per day, including 5.95 million civilians. So this truly is one of the great world events, not only to occur in the 20th century, but to occur in all of world history. And so the one crucial takeaway we want to remember from this is that this is again going to be literally death leading the army to a lot of these people's untimely and certain demises. So to get an introduction for the First World War, which is what our goal is for today, the first thing is want to go through some of the different terms. And as we've alluded to in the past couple of lecture units and their lectures, is that we've been working towards this conflict since the fall of Napoleon. Imperialism, which was our last unit, kind of got into the idea of expanding worldwide empires and playing upon the idea of social Darwinism, that only the fittest and strongest nations are the ones that are going to survive. And that's going to play right into the hands of beginning the First World War. Nationalism, what we talked about prior to imperialism, again, the idea that your nation is greater and what everybody should be doing is trying to advance their nation at the expense of all others is going to be another important part that plays into this. Right? Again, the idea of the willingness to pay the ultimate sacrifice for your country. An idea that we've touched on previously, but really plays a huge part in this is the idea of militarism. And this is a country's kind of beliefs and foreign policy that war is going to solve not one or two of its problems, but all of these problems. And this is born uh, Otto von Bismarck's speech of blood and iron. Again, what he was saying on the with the unification of Germany, that blood and iron will solve the problems of the day, and Prussia being the major kind of forerunner for this idea of making sure that building up your army, the army is going to have a lot of say in how the country is not only run internally, but how it deals with other countries around the world. And the important part to take away from this idea of militarism is that this militarism, prior to World War One, will lead to a major arms race amongst the different nations to have the best guns, the best technology, the best tanks, the best, all this other type of stuff, the best arms, right? Battleships and naval arms race is the big one, right? Amongst all these nations, and it's going to be this big giant competition, and it where it kind of boils down to the point where you have all this stuff, might as well just use it. Another idea that we'll touch on, which is also going to be important, is these alliances. And prior to the First World War, we talked about with the Congress of Vienna, the kind of idea of the concert of Europe and the Metternich system, where you have all these alliances and deals in place to help you if you're attacked. But a lot of these alliances become secret. A lot of these alliances change, and that balance of power that the Europeans are tenuously holding on to through the 1800s begins to kind of strangle itself in this system of alliances that goes and takes a local conflict and turns it into a giant worldwide war. And that's what kind of this cartoon gets into is again is that this very tangled web of alliances that's going to strangle Europe, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. As we're working through and going over this, we'll see that prior to World War One, as we turn the calendar into the 1900s, the world in 1901 is a world of different empires. And what we'll see is that the problem that the world is facing is not these empires' weaknesses, right, but it's the actual empire strengths that are going to cause the different problems in all the different countries and the empires that are there. Throughout the chapter, we'll see the end of monarchies, we'll see the end of the empires, the Hohenzollerns, the Habsburgs, the Romanov families, people who've controlled the politics and the policy of millions of Europeans for hundreds of years are going to be gone by the time the war is over here. World War One is kind of the crowning achievement of nationalism. All right, we'll see new nations emerge out of the chaos that follows the end of the war, and we'll see the rise of dictatorships. When the war is over and the dust has settled, Europe is really found itself horrified, and it's going to try to choose stability in these different dictators who are going to come to power out of the ramifications and effects of the war instead of democracy, much to the chagrin of the U.S. president, Woodrow Wilson, who's trying to enshrine all these different democracies in Europe. So that's what's going on from there. Now, what's important to understand as we move in here is that all of these different countries and their kingdoms and their heads of these are all related. This is a picture of all the kings of Europe at a birthday party for the Queen of England and the king there because they're all related. And in fact, the Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, is cousins with Tsar Alexander of Russia. And as they're fighting, I mean, they're exchanging letters, right? Of saying, "Hey, how's it going? How's the sister cousin-in-law?" and all that different stuff from there. So it's a very in one sense, an old war that's fought amongst families and squabblings in that way, but also a very much a modern war that you're probably familiar with. So the big thing today is to not only introduce the war, but also go through the origins and set up why the war begins with. We're going to spend a lot of time on understanding how the World War comes into being, because that's really important in trying to understand, especially when we get toward the end here of assigning who's to blame and who should pay what and all of those different things. We're going to work our way through the different major combatants, and we're going to start in Germany. With Germany, the personality of the Kaiser or the king, the leader of Germany, is extraordinarily important. It is to the extreme disappointment to millions of people and to others around the world that Kaiser Wilhelm II takes over Germany at this point. His father has gone, the first Kaiser of the newly unified Germany, and now he has come into power. He really holds on to and values this very old medieval kind of archaic militarism that again everything needs to be decided by war. He has this sense of ambition, this vaulting ambition that he wants to be on par with his cousins in Britain and his cousins in Russia. But this is all covering for a major neurotic insecurity that he has down to his core. When he's being yanked out of his mom being born, his arm kind of gets caught up and mungled around from there, and so it's left arm, I think, and so he is unable to do a lot of these kind of traditional manly and military stuff from there. In the sense he wouldn't be able to go and fight in this war. Or handle a sword or ride a horse in a military type situation. And so it's his inability to do that, which he kind of hides through this big giant bravado and puffing out his chest and things of that nature. Germany is the most dynamic economy in Europe, and it's looking to expand. And as we talked about in the imperialism unit, it's forced to call the Berlin Conference in the 1870s and 1880s, right, the 1880s, right, in order to be able to try to find any scraps that are left around the world. Because once they unify and they begin to say, well, how can we build our empire? There's nothing left for them. So because it unifies late, there's not much left land freeing, and so they're doing that. Now, this new Germany that unified in the Hall of Mirrors in 1871, following the Franco-Prussian War, is dominated still by this old Prussian aristocracy. And the Prussian aristocracy that kind of got that power by being in the military brings this militarism to this new Germany, and that kind of moves its way through all the other different states and other smaller German principalities that have been swallowed up in this German unification. Prior to World War One, the German military is the envy of the world. It has universal military conscription for all men at age 18. They have to serve for 2 years. They have a dedicated general staff for planning. They take the best and brightest of the people in the country and they put them in a room and say, hey, come up with a plan. Germany needs to invade New Jersey. Come up with a plan if Germany needs to invade Chile. Come up with a plan if Germany needs to invade Japan while simultaneously fighting in California. All these different stuff. And so they have people sitting down and coming up from there. They believe in scientific management of their railroad mobility, and that's going to be a key thing. What the Germans take away from the Franco-Prussian War is that by being able to put their troops onto trains and be able to use their train network, which is kind of the envy of Europe at this point, they are going to be able to move their troops, be able to maximize their forces at their enemies' weak points, be able to move it all around there to give them an advantage that the other countries would not possess. So this is our Kaiser, and Kaiser Wilhelm again is the head of Germany, and he's going to be the one that's going to be kind of uh, pushing for a lot of the things as we'll see coming. But again, he's been leading kind of the saber rattling here in Europe for a while now. Austria-Hungary is our next country. And Austria-Hungary, as we talked about before, is not just Austria and Hungary. It's the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There's over 18 different nationalities across five distinct kingdoms, two grand duchies, one principality, six regular duchies, and six other territorial units. If it sounds complicated, it is. Even the Austro-Hungarians are struggling to kind of piece all this together, and it's a major giant mess. The only thing that is the tenuous glue that's holding all these different people together is their loyalty to the elderly Emperor Franz Joseph I. He has this very kind of Santa Clausy, grandfatherly look and appeal to him, and so he's trying to go around the empire in towards the later years of his life here, and trying to talk to all these different people, trying to get them onto the same page from there. And everybody recognizes that hey, this is the empire's not going to last past him, but they are saying he's doing his best. He's trying to look out for it. He's trying something, and so that's really holding everybody together by the thinnest of threads. However, as we just said, by trying to treat everybody in all these different nationalities tolerantly, it ends up just paralyzing the government. So anything that they promise the people in Prague, they can't do in Sarajevo because the government it's a big, huge, giant mess. Austria-Hungary is also by forms of expansion in Europe governing the Balkans. And we talked about this before. The Balkans is an area on the globe which is one of the great fault lines historically, not so much uh, geographically. And so, because there's so many different ethnicities and different nationalities in the Balkans in a small, tiny little area, it becomes very much ripe for a major conflict to erupt out of there, and particularly when all the different little countries start to become countries and start aligning themselves with big, powerful empires, it becomes a major problem. The Balkans have been slowly being taken over from by the Austro-Hungarians as the Ottoman Empire has been slowly being beaten out of Europe for over 300 years. But Austro-Hungary really has only been governing this area for a very small amount of time, and the people there very much recognize that and don't appreciate that Austria-Hungary is kind of taking over and leading them there. So this is Franz Josef. Again, he's again kind of got this very charismatic, this grandfatherly personality, and he's trying to do his best, and everybody recognizes that he's going around trying to help everybody. But again, by trying to help everyone and treating everybody the same, it just causes even more problems and more chaos. Great Britain is facing a paradoxical predicament as it moves into the 20th century. It is, as we've talked about in the prior units, at this point, the wealthiest power in the world. It possesses the world's greatest empire in terms of territory covering the globe. The financial center of the entire world is at the British capital in London, and it pretty much is unchallenged on the seas for the most part, and it kind of from there. However, this great power in the world is more vulnerable than it ever has been to the needs of having all of its different colonies around the world bring foodstuffs, the things to eat, to Britain in order to be able to feed a rising urban population. as we saw in the agricultural revolution and industrial revolution, as more and more British people move from the farmland to the cities, they're able to make up some of it with gains in technology, but they really need the wheat coming from Canada and they need the tea coming out of India. And so they're kind of facing that problem as it is. Britain also is worried about the problems being built by the new German fleet. As Germany begins to industrialize and become a major industrial nation, competing with Britain, competing with the United States, Germany begins to build this own big, huge, giant fleet in order to be able to kind of join the world powers uh, on the world stage here. What Britain is worried about is not so much the fleet that Germany is currently building, say in 1907, but the admirals in the Navy department are looking at projections for steel production and more and more foundries and other stuff. And they're worried about, well, what's the German fleet going to look like in 1910 and 1915 and 1920? And when they start to do those productions, they begin to become worried about the threat this new German fleet would pose to the British, who need a fleet in order to protect themselves from anybody trying to cut off the food coming into Britain itself. And so they start building a big, huge, giant new brand, making new fleet of their own, which all this costs money. And it begins to come at a time when there's social problems and class conflict in Britain, and they begin to run into some different issues there. The major thing that Britain begins to do that really sets off this naval arms race is this boat laid in the 1890s, the HMS Dreadnought, and this is kind of the first true modern quote unquote battleship that becomes the envy of the world and whatever it does, it creates kind of this own class of quote unquote super battleships or the Dreadnought class of battleship that everybody then wants to go out and build for itself. And this battleship in particular sets off this naval arms race amongst the great nations in order to be able to compete with this. The HMS Dreadnought had five 12-inch guns, so five guns with a diameter of 12 inches, kind of the hole, the barrel from there, that could fire an 850-pound shell 14.2 miles into the sea. And because they're on the ocean and it's rocking and it's rolling, and this is beyond the horizon that you can engage ships with, they have some of the first kind of quote unquote think of computers, how you're watching this, the first early ones are being placed onto ships like this in order to be able to accurately factor in the earth rotating and the sea moving and the winds to be able to make those calculations to drop these giant armor piercing shells on the decks of these other ships. They're not the only country that's kind of at this game of trying to upping the ante here for the poker game of what ship and what new technology are they going to bring to the stage. For France, France and Great Britain have had this rivalry that's been going back and forth for 100 years. About 1689 to 1815, the French and British are at each other's throats. And it's going to take them another 100 years to realize they're no longer friends, but
What? Did we just become best friends?
so what the French have found is that the revolution of 1789 has redistributed a lot of land in France to peasants who don't want change or grow. They finally got what they wanted, their own land. And so that's what they would. There's not this kind of big giant industrial growth that we see in France like we do in Britain or Germany or the United States. Also, because the French kind of become more content with themselves, they begin to lose population. And what we mean by this is that they're still having babies and there's people still coming into France, but they're not growing at a rate as what Germany is doing or other places, and that begins to worry the French here. The French, out of again the French Revolution, remain deeply divided between those who want to stop the revolutionary spirit that kind of led to uprisings in 1848 and the communes in the 1870s, and those who wanted to go even farther. And then you have the socialists on top of that. So there's lots of different class conflict here in France. And France begins, all right, as we move into the 1910s, to become very anxious about Germany. And so they become even more dependent because of their smaller army to France's, or to Germany's, on Russia and this kind of big giant sleeping giant that Russia is to kind of counterbalance and put this very militaristic and very um, pro in invading Germany, kind of smack dab between France to the west and Russia to the east. Speaking about Russia, Russia at this point, as we move into the 20th century, is struggling to enter into the modern world. It is having all sorts of different problems as it tries to kind of figure out, move out of a medieval world sense that it's way behind all the other European countries into, again, something that was just 120 years ago. Railroad in development in the 1890s has allowed the Russian economy to expand, like we saw with the Industrial Revolution with other countries there. However, the head of the Russia regime, like the government, is terrified that if it increases any farther industrial development, it would only encourage further political reform for people getting more money and more modest things and moving out of the system, which causes them to try to be more hesitant towards industrializing, which again, kind of this. The entire government is nearly overthrown in 1905. They have to rely on machine gunning their own citizens in order to keep that from happening and try to be able to promise some kind of political hopes and stuff from that way. But the brutal suppression of this leads to further political terrorist acts against the regime, which causes a kind of cycle where they counteract with more kind of breaking stuff down and taking things over, which then kind of ends as a back and forth cycle from there. Russia itself possesses the largest population and biggest military in all of Europe. And so it has a lot of good things going for it. It's got a big, huge, giant territory. It's got a big military. It's got all these wonderful advantages and it has this terrific potential, but it has to overcome the vast distances of the country itself and also the incredible ineptness it has in managing it. In order to be able to move a German soldier, or sorry, a Russian soldier from, say, like Moscow to, say, like the Russian German front, right, it has to travel through like 4 or 5 different gauges of track, meaning how far the different things. So it's got to get off one. So you can't just go and zip from there, be able to and move the stuff from there. And these other countries know about this and are planning on it and working on stuff from there. And so while the young Tsar Alexander, is kind of in charge here, visiting the Asian side, and here he is in Nagasaki, Japan, he really is struggling to enter this modern world like all the other ones. And so Germany, looking to its east, sees this big, huge, giant Russian giant ready to flick its mustache and cause all sorts of problems, where to the west it sees kind of this age-old enemy in France. So Germany in 1900 is this strong European power. However, it faces this potential threat on both sides of its country. So to try to manage the enemies, it's got to create alliances. These alliances very early on are dependent on the abilities of the Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. However, when Kaiser Wilhelm II takes over, he doesn't like Bismarck. He doesn't like how he kind of seems that he's running the country. The Kaiser wants to be kind of publicly seen as the leader. Bismarck is forced out, and Wilhelm's kind of forced and not very diplomatic way of kind of forging these foreign relationships forces a reorganizing of Europe, which, as we move into the eve of World War One, puts Europe into two different camps. On one side, you have one alliance called the Triple Alliance, and in the war itself, they will be called the Central Powers because they are going to be centrally located for the most part in Europe. On the other side is going to be another alliance called the Triple Entente. Now, both of these are the same word, Triple Alliance, Triple Entente. Entente is the French word for alliance. So that should help you understand that the Triple Alliance is not going to contain France. The Central Powers are going to consist of Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Italy, right in the center of Europe. And on the other side, Russia is going to ally with France, with Russia on one side of Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Italy, France on the other, and then Great Britain after negotiations. I mean, pretty close up into World War One, within a couple of years, is going to side with France and sign an alliance that way. And so what we have here in Europe is basically on the one side the Triple Entente here in red, France, Russia, and Great Britain, and then over here, we have the Central Powers of Italy, Austria, Hungary, and Germany. Now, later on, we'll see the Ottoman Empire join the Central Powers. And again, there's smaller countries that are also aligned to this, which we'll see are going to play an important role in the beginning of the war here. So on the eve of World War One, the world as it looks in 1914 is going to look very similar to this, with in this map the Triple Entente in blue colors, Britain, France, and Russia, and our central powers, the Triple Alliance in red in the center of the country. So, as kind of move towards starting the war here, where does the war start? It starts in the Balkans. And so the Balkans are going to be where trouble begins. The Balkans at this point are called the powder keg of Europe. Powder being gunpowder, and it's just waiting for a small little match to set off a big, huge, giant explosion that's going to consume kind of the world here. As we talked about, nationalism is taking Austria-Hungary and ripping it apart. And on the peripheries of Austria-Hungary, these small little national countries are going to start fighting for their own kind of independence. So in 1912, we see the First Balkan War, where the country of Serbia targets Macedonia to try to expand. Right? In 1912, later on, there's a Second Baltic War, where Serbia fights over who gets what out of Macedonia with Bulgaria. In 1913, the Ottoman Empire begins having internal problems and begins to crumble and collapse and have all sorts of issues that way. And so in 1913, Austria-Hungary is watching another big, huge, giant empire, the Ottomans, fall apart with nationalist uprisings and class conflicts and all these other things. And they're kind of looking in the Ottoman Empire just like you would look in the mirror and are saying, we don't want this to happen to ourselves. So we got to look for any sort of way to be able to keep this from causing issues for us. Austria-Hungary, as it's looking into the Balkans, sees Serbia as the most feared Balkan state. Right? Austria-Hungary, first off, doesn't even feel that the Serbian government that's in charge there is a legitimate government. The leaders of Serbia came into power in 1903 when this new expansionist regime brutally overthrew the Obrenovich dynasty that had been ruling Serbia and kind of put in a very pro-military, a pro kind of expanding Serbia's borders there and has been doing from this. Serbia, for its point of view, is bent on liberating all the Serbs, right, of their own cultural and ethnic groups under different foreign rule, right, particularly in the area and around Bosnia. Who is helping Serbia kind of do this, and this is important to understand, is Russia. Russia considers themselves very ethnically similar to the Serbs. Right? They both feel they're part of the same Slavic kind of culture and race. And so, just like how on a playground, the big brother might be doing big brother things, and the little brother might be going causing and stirring up problems, Serbia, the little brother, can always count on Russia to be kind of looking over its shoulder and helping it out. And it can kind of do what it wants because if anybody messes with Serbia, they have to go and understand that they're going to be getting themselves involved with the big brother of Russia. As we move through 1913, fear and frustration begins to mount in Austria. They become fearful about how minorities are going to respond to the Serbian successes in 1912 and 1913, and they become even more frustrated about apparently any lack of ability for them to do anything about it. Because again, if they try to check Serbian expansion through the military, they're going to bring Russia in, and Austria feels it can defeat Serbia in a war, but Austria does not in any way, shape, or form feel that it can compete with Serbia and Russia teaming up on Austria together. And so it's kind of like stuck. It's angry what the Serbs are doing, but they're frustrated they can't do anything about it. So Austria, trying in a kind of diplomatic ploy, begins by annexing the territory of Bosnia from the collapsing Ottoman Empire territories and say, this is now a part of us. As we just said earlier on this slide, Serbia wants to help liberate the Serbs in Bosnia under that, so this is going to do this. So the response to this act by Serbia is to create a terrorist organization sponsored by the government to attack the Austrians for this kind of apparent aggression in their eyes. And so this is the area that we're talking about. It's all in this territory here. This is all have been owned in various times and places by the Ottoman Empire up in the 1600s. The Ottoman Empire was going all the way up towards Vienna, but slowly over the last 300 years, it's gone away. And so as it's gone away, countries like Serbia have popped up asking for its own independence. They want to go and liberate different Serbs under other places, but Austria-Hungary is saying Bosnia is now ours, and that's going to go and lead to different issues. So where we're going to stop for today is where the have this political cartoon here where Serbia is kind of standing up and is grabbing more stuff for itself. Austria-Hungary is trying to stare it down, but the big ominous Russian bear is peering behind the corner, kind of acting and allowing for Serbia to kind of walk its walk here. And